I'd like to do something a little different today. I'd like to tell you a story. This is a true story, and this is a ghost story. Are you guys ready for a ghost story? All right. When I was ordained to the priesthood in the Diocese of Alaska, I was the youngest priest by 20 or 30 years. So I was frequently tapped on the shoulder to travel to the remote villages to perform weddings, do Eucharistic services, baptisms, and sadly, many, many funerals. I got the call one day that I was to visit a small village on the Yukon River, the lower Yukon, called Anvik, Alaska. Now, the history of the Episcopal and Anglican Church in this part of the world is that the Anglican Church from Canada came down from the upper Yukon, and then from the lower Yukon, the Episcopal Church, and somewhere in the middle they met. Now, this is not a small area of land. At the 8:30 service, I said this is the Yukon River drainage between the Alaska Range and the Brooks Range is about the size of California, but I looked between the services. It's more like the size of the state of Texas, a vast area missionized by our tradition since the mid-19th century, with villages, entire villages along the Yukon that are entirely Episcopalian and have been baptized Episcopalian for 5, 6, 7 generations. A rich tradition out in these villages. But over time, the priest left, and over time, the missionaries left, and so many of these communities don't receive communion regularly. So I got the call to visit Anvik. Anvik is located at the intersection of the Innoko River and the mighty Yukon River. It has about 80 people, full-time residents who live there. It is like stepping back into not just a different century, but a different millennium. There is no cash economy in many of these Alaskan villages. They subsist off of hunting moose and caribou and putting up salmon in the summertime. And maybe the only paying jobs in the whole village are the school teachers who come and go and the post office. So I boarded a single-engine prop plane, and to get to Anvik, you have to fly through a little narrow division in the Alaska Range, and we've all been on flights, maybe on jets, that have been a little bit bumpy. This was a bumpy flight. So I was a little bit nervous, and I'm a fourth-generation Alaskan. I've been all over the state, but largely in the parts of the state that you can actually access by the road system, where you're never too far away from quote-unquote civilization. But this was really my first time going to a remote village that is entirely off of the grid. So we made it over the Alaska Range and descended to the airport at Anvik, Alaska, which consists of a gravel airstrip. So I get out of the airplane, and I'm left there with the bag of mail for the week. And I'm waiting, and it's 15 minutes, and it's 20 minutes, and then I hear a little buzz. And up drives a young man on a four-wheeler. He says, "Get on." So he puts the bag of mail on the front, and I hop on the back, and we go into town. Now, in 1885, the Episcopal Church set up a mission and a mission school in Anvik. And so there's a tiny chapel, but it's a beautiful, pristine type of chapel, the type of chapel that you would see in New England or in Virginia, white clapboard chapel in the middle of the Yukon wilderness. And then a more of a log cabin-like long house where the mission was, and also where the school was. Now, the first missionary that went there was a man named Reverend Mr. Chapman, and he embedded himself in the community, and he held school, and he was beloved by the folks in this congregation. It was around 1885 when that happened. And I'd always heard that the Episcopal Church was one of the better missionary churches, if there is such a thing, in Alaska. The Presbyterians were pretty bad and brutal toward the native population. There's sort of a mixed bag with the Russian Orthodox. The Russian fur traders basically enslaved the native population, and the church was seen as an ameliorating force. But I'd always heard that the Episcopal Church was more compassionate in how it spread the good news amongst the natives of Alaska. And so it was founded by Mr. Chapman. His son grew up, was sent away for school, and then later came back as the Reverend Dr. Chapman. And he became the priest in the village, and he also became something of a notorious character in the story as well, because unlike his father, the Reverend Dr. Chapman held very strong views. So he outlawed the speaking of Gwich'in Athabascan of the natives in the community. Previously, the prayer book and the Bible had been translated into Gwich'in Athabascan. And if you want to see conservatives when it comes to changes in the prayer book, go to interior Alaska, where they don't want to change from the 28 prayer book, but that's because it's in Athabascan. But he outlawed the native languages, and he outlawed the traditional native dancing, and he outlawed the making of native masks. In fact, he had some of these masks that have been there for generations sent to museums in Chicago and in Washington, D.C. Most of all, and most disappointing, was that he did not believe that the Alaska Natives should be ordained into the priesthood. So after I had arrived in this community and met with the senior warden, and she took me around to different elders' houses to bring communion to the folks who were shut in. We had a communion service in this pristine chapel, and then we had a potlatch with wonderful roast moose. Have you guys had roast moose? Oh, you haven't lived yet. And caribou, and beaver tail soup, and smoked salmon. And then we had another service after that. And by the end of the day, I was pretty tired and exhausted, and I wasn't sure where I was going to sleep. So I said, "Well, you're going to sleep in the mission house, the old mission house, which had now been converted to be a combination of meeting house and VPSO office. VPSO, Village Public Safety Officer. This is like the police force for the community. And so basically I slept on the floor of where people who were arrested are until the troopers can come in and take them off to jail. But I was tired, but I had one of those restless, fitful nights of sleep where, you know what, when you wake up and you fall asleep for an hour and you wake up another hour and you fall back asleep, and that was the type of sleep that I had. The sun was out because it's Alaska in the summertime, almost 24 hours. More importantly, the mosquitoes were out and the buzzing of the mosquitoes were getting to me. But I would fall asleep and I woke up and I'm sleeping on the floor and I could see between the slats of the floor a light is on. I thought, oh, that's odd. Somebody else must be staying here at the mission house. And I fall asleep and I wake back up again and the light is off. And I fall asleep and I wake back up and the light's on again and I'm hearing noises of like somebody moving around. And this happened a couple more times, and by the time I woke up in the morning and met with the senior warden and a couple other church leaders, and we were sitting around having coffee, the senior warden said, well, how was your night? And I said, oh, I had a rough night of sleep. Is there someone else who's staying in the mission house? Because I saw the light going on and I heard movement. I figured maybe, there's a basement that was dug into the earth or something like that. He said, oh, "You mean the ghost." And this is the story that she told me. There was a native man who grew up as a boy serving as an acolyte for the Reverend Mr. Chapman. And he was one of the first students at this mission school, and he took to English pretty well. So he ended up becoming something of an interpreter and as well as an acolyte between the Anglo community and the Gwich'in Athabascan native community in Anvik and the surrounding areas. And he would follow Mr. Chapman around to help do the services and sometimes even translate the sermons. But he stayed in the village, he remained there, and was seen as something of a spiritual leader or shaman within that community, although he wasn't ordained. And years later, the Reverend Dr. Chapman came with a different understanding and theology of what it meant to be a Christian and what was required to be ordained to the priesthood. And he stopped letting this man participate in the services because he felt that he was too close to the native animist beliefs. And this man was so crushed that he moved just to the periphery of the village. And he lived there for the rest of his life until he passed away, of the village, but not in the village, with a foot just sort of as a peripatetic holy man that villagers would sometimes go to talk to and receive advice from, but not being accepted in the very church of which he felt called to minister. And then he passed away. The senior warden, she told me that amongst the worst things that this Dr. Chapman did was in order to erase the native animist beliefs that when the rivers rose, as they do in the Yukon, and the banks erode, he physically had the chapel and the mission house moved to a different location and cited that location on what was believed to be a native burial ground. Now, I know, every ghost story starts with a house was built on an Indian graveyard, right? But whether or not this is true in this case, it doesn't really matter. The villagers believe that this is what happened. So when I was sleeping in the mission house, I was ostensibly sleeping over the graves of the ancestors. And she says to me that the ghost is not here to bother you. We invited you to come here to our community. Because I was a little freaked out. Maybe, am I not supposed to be here? We invited you so that we could have baptisms and we could have communion, which we haven't had for years. But the ghost of this holy man was letting you know, like Zacchaeus in the gospel this morning, gifted by God, whose holiness recognized by God when the others didn't see or accept, that this holy man's spirit is like a spiritual priest and presence to this community, so that when you or other clergy are not here, that you can know that this community is watched over and prayed for and loved. Amen.